You can pre-order Modern Horizons 3 using my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Modern Horizons 3 set review. I've already covered all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today I'm continuing with blue. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in Play Boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards in the main set in this video. Play Boosters in this set do have a bonus sheet, but I'll talk about the bonus sheet in its own video. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some stuff. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll do some videos giving you my updates. Lastly, I want to let you know that there is a set review related perk for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades when the set review is complete. If that interests you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at all the blue cards in Modern Horizons 3. First up, we've got Ether Spike, which for one generic and a blue is a common instant. Choose target spell, you get 2 energy counters. Then you may pay any amount of energy, counter that spell unless its controller pays 1 generic for each energy paid this way. So energy is a big theme in the format. Basically, they're just counters you can get that you can spend like you could spend any other resource, and they give you some bonus effects like you see here. Lately, 2 mana for a counterspell that counters something unless the opponent pays 2 has been pretty solid, and Ether Spike has some other stuff going on too, namely you can pump more energy into it to make it better, or in a pinch you can just use it to generate some energy, I guess, though that's far from optimal. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Amphibian Downpour, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment aura with flash, and it has Storm, that's right. Whenever you cast this spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. Copies become tokens. It has Enchant Creature. An enchanted creature loses all abilities, and it's a blue frog creature token with base power and toughness, 1/1. I feel like they should have just named this It's Raining Frogs. But anyway, normally this type of spell that doesn't entirely remove a creature isn't that good in Limited, since you actually end up behind. After all, they keep a 1/1 that can attack or block or be sacrificed and so forth. However, getting more than 1 copy of Amphibian Downpour makes a huge difference, because once you're making a couple of creatures into 1/1s with 1 card, you are getting some value worth more than a card, and getting 2 copies of the Downpour isn't that hard. Your opponent just has to cast something on their turn and you get 2 copies, and getting more isn't that much of a stretch either. It also has flash, so sometimes you can use it as a pseudo combat trick. In an ideal world, you want to get at least a couple of copies of it though. The baseline card here is probably like a D+, C- level card, but this is going to give you multiple copies pretty often, and that makes a big difference. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we've got Bespoke Battle Wagon, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 5/6 artifact vehicle at uncommon. You can tap it to get 2 energy, you can tap it and pay 2 energy to tap a creature, you can tap it and pay 3 energy to draw a card, and you can pay 4 energy to have it become an artifact creature until end of turn. It's also got Crew 4. A 4 mana 5/6 vehicle with Crew 4 is not good. That crew cost is just way too high, but this can do a whole bunch of other stuff. It can produce some energy, and if it stopped there, it probably still wouldn't be good, but it can also cash in energy, including to make itself a creature without crewing it. Basically, if you have an energy deck, this looks pretty solid because you're both likely to be able to use the energy on other stuff and able to spend the energy this makes on other stuff. I'm a little skeptical this is anything amazing. Most of the time, it doesn't impact the board right away, and that's probably just a C. Next up, it's Brain Surge, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon instant. Draw 4 cards and put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in a random order. Well, it's not quite Brainstorm, but it's still a pretty solid card selection spell. It lets you dig pretty deep into your deck, and it doesn't give you a huge card advantage since you have to put 2 back. But the blue-black deck in this format is really interested in drawing cards, and this will slot in nicely there, giving it a C. Next up, it's Consigned to Memory, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon instant. It has a Replicate 1 generic, and that means when you cast it, you can copy it for each time you paid its Replicate cost. You may choose new targets for the copy, counter target triggered ability, or colorless spell. This isn't a card that's here for limited players for the most part. Countering a triggered ability isn't worth a card, so you're left with leaning on the ability to counter colorless spells. There are more colorless spells than usual in this set, and for that reason, it's probably a reasonable sideboard card, but I'm pretty concerned about putting this in your main deck because many opponents will have like 2 targets, and that just isn't enough. I think it's an F in your main deck, but potentially a C+ out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Copy Crook, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 0/0 shapeshifter rogue at uncommon. You can have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it has, whenever this creature attacks, it connives. That means you draw a card and then discard a card, and if you discard a non-land card, you put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Clones that can copy any creature instead of just your own creatures are way, way better, and this one even comes with the big upside of connive, so you're going to have a slightly better version of whatever the best creature on the battlefield is when you play this. Chances are reasonable that you can get 4 mana worth of value out of it, but it won't always line up even when it can copy a creature on either side. There are times where clones are just awkward. Still, I think the ceiling is so high on this that I'm going to give it a B-. Next up, it's Corrupted Shapeshifter, which for 3 generic and a blue is a Star Eldrazi Shapeshifter at common. It has Devoid, which means it's colorless, and as Corrupted Shapeshifter enters the battlefield, it becomes your choice of a 3/3 creature with flying, a 2/5 creature with vigilance, or a 0/12 creature with defender. You don't get a great deal no matter what route you take here. The most efficient is probably the 3/3 flyer, and that's certainly the body that impacts the board the most too, but the flexibility to choose between these 3 options doesn't hurt. It's a little awkward that the 2/5 Vigilance and the 0/12 Defender are kind of good in the same situations. I would have liked another mode other than one where it's like a 3/3 flyer and then 2 defensive modes, but it's still an okay card. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Deem Inferior, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common sorcery. It costs 1 generic less to cast for each card you've drawn this turn, and the owner of target non-land permanent puts it into their library second from the top or on the bottom. 4 mana for this effect at sorcery speed is probably a C-. It's a little expensive, and even though it trades 1 for 1, it doesn't permanently deal with the target. That said, it's basically never going to cost 4, it'll cost 3 most of the time, and often even less. It is interesting, in some ways it's actually better to put a target on top of your opponent's library because you make them redraw the same card. That's one of the advantages you can get from this kind of card, but if the thing you bounced is really, really scary, you're going to be glad that it's going to take longer for your opponent to get to it. Anyway, overall I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Depth Defiler, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/5 Eldrazi at uncommon. It's got Devoid and Kicker for a colorless mana. Remember, colorless mana is mana that isn't one of the 5 colors. You can't just spend any kind of mana on that. And of course, Kicker means you can pay an additional amount of mana as you cast a spell, in this case, 1 colorless. And when you cast it, you choose one, and if it was kicked, you choose both. You return target creature to its owner's hand, or target player draws 2 cards and discards a card. 5 mana for a 3/5 with a choice between these 2 enter the battlefield abilities would probably already be a C+. Balance isn't always good these days, with all the enter the battlefield abilities and things like that, but when it's good, it's still pretty good. You add a body and take one away after all. Meanwhile, the draw trigger is good in more situations, and it also synergizes with the blue-black theme. When you kick it, it's going to feel really great. I'm giving this a B. Next, we've got Dreamtide Whale, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 7/5 whale at rare. It has Vanishing 2. That means it enters with 2 time counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter from it, and when the last is removed, you sacrifice it. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Proliferate. This means you choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. A 3 mana 7/5 with no downside would be an awesome card, but Vanishing is some serious downside. It basically means that this can block twice and attack once. That's not good, so you're really going to need to Proliferate or this card is kind of a disaster. And double spelling in the early game, like you'll really need to if you play this on turn 3, is sometimes pretty tough. And by the time it's easier to double spell, a vanilla 7/5 isn't as much of a problem. It does get better if you have more counter stuff, and there is counter stuff in the set, but I think this is just too hard to make work to take advantage of how efficient it is. I'm giving it a D+. Next, we've got Aclazotz, which for 2 generic and a blue is a jellyfish. It's a 3/1 at common. It's got flash and flying. When it enters, you get 2 energy, and at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you tap it unless you pay 1 energy. A 3 mana 3/1 with flash and flying is a C+ at the very, very best. Sure, it can ambush block stuff and in general give you some flexibility, and it hits pretty hard, but it also dies to everything. And this jellyfish comes with kind of a weird ability. It comes with some upside and some downside. Getting some energy is valuable, but the Aclazotz demands your energy just to stay untapped, and that's pretty rough. It's not like you're getting that good of a deal on this card, so I'm a little surprised that it comes with this kind of downside. Should have made it a 3/3 or something, or at least a 3/2. I'd rather spend my energy on more powerful effects most of the time instead of keeping my mediocre creature untapped. I think it's a C-. Next, we've got Emrakul's Messenger, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Eldrazi Fairy Rogue at uncommon. It's got Devoid and Flying. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add colorless. This is nice. A 2-mana 2/1 flyer is a good starting point, and this is likely to spit out at least one spawn most of the time, and you're getting an amazing deal if that's all you do, and this has real engine potential, giving it a B. Next, we've got Flare of Denial, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant. You may sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost, counter target spell. So the baseline here is Cancel, a D+ or C- level card most of the time. Double blue is surprisingly hard to come by when you need it in limited, and having to leave mana up and hope your opponent runs something into your cancel can result in a huge tempo hit. Flare of Denial gets around those downsides to some extent, since you can cast it for free, but you do have to 2-for-1 yourself to do it, and that's far from ideal in limited, but sometimes you just gotta do it because your opponent's playing something crazy, and it can still be cancel when you need it to be. I think it's probably a C. Next up, it's Harbinger of the Seas, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard at rare. Non-basic lands are islands. This format does have more non-basics than most do because of the modal double-faced cards. Hosing those can be pretty funny sometimes, but this is too situational and too inefficient to be worth playing. You may occasionally find a spot where you actually want to side it in, but I think it's just an F. Next, we've got Hope Ender Coatl, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Eldrazi Snake at uncommon. It's got Devoid and Flash. Whenever you cast this spell, you counter target spell an opponent controls unless they pay 1 generic, and it has flying. This is an early candidate for my favorite limited card in the set. I just love counter spells that add to the board, and this is a really good one. Adding to the board and countering a spell at the same time is just super strong, and the body you get here is actually pretty solid. Now, your opponent won't always play something when you leave your 3 mana up, and sometimes they'll be able to pay the 1, but the fail case is still that you use your mana to add to the board, and you have this serious 2-for-1 upside, giving this a B. Next, it's Kozilek's Unsealing, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment with Devoid. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, you create 2 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens, and whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, you draw 3 cards. This doesn't add to the board on its own, but these payoffs are pretty legit. Getting 2 0/1s can ramp your mana in addition to just adding to your board, and drawing 3 when you cast something expensive, which those spawns can help you with, is pretty awesome. It does maybe feel a bit like a Windmore, but I do like that the bodies this generates can help you get to the point where you draw 3, either because they can keep you alive or they just give you mana. This does probably need a build around grade, as it's pretty bad unless you're in the right kind of deck. It's probably a D in your typical blue deck, but I think it has a ceiling near a B. Next, we've got Petrifying Meddler, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 4/5 Eldrazi at common with Devoid. Whenever you cast it, tap up to 1 target creature and put a stun counter on it. Also has Reach. Adding a beefy body to the board and stunning something is nice value for 5 mana. These days, stunning is often better than bouncing something, and this seems like a pretty good common, giving it a C+. Next up, we've got Royal Cartographer, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 uncommon Merfolk Rogue. It's got landfall. Whenever land enters a battlefield under your control, you get an energy, and you can tap it and pay 6 energy to draw 3 cards. This has an almost passable body, and in an energy deck, it's going to give you a lot of value, and of course, it's a powerful place to sink energy all on its own. Drawing 3 is insane, especially when you don't spend any mana, since you're likely to be able to play the things you drew right away. 6 energy is a lot, even with the Cartographer around, but between her ability to generate and spend energy, and help your other things have energy to get going, this looks like a really good 2-drop to me, giving it a B-. Next, it's Sage of the Unknowable, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 0/4 human wizard at common. You can tap it for colorless, but you can spend the mana only to cast a colorless spell or to activate an ability. Even in this set with Devoid and lots of other colorless things, the restriction on the mana is pretty rough. Sure, it's a source of colorless, that does matter, but this set doesn't have so many cards you can use this mana on that it's going to be amazing. The stat line isn't good either. 0 power creatures are a pretty big liability these days. I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Serum Visionary, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Vidalcan Wizard at common. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then scry 2. Well, this is great. It's basically Serum Visions on a stick. 3 mana 2/2 that draws you a card when it enters the battlefield is already pretty good. A card you basically always play, a card that generates 2-for-1s, and then this also scries for you to improve your next couple of draws. This is going to be like a bread and butter common for every blue deck in the format. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Shadow of the Second Sun, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a mythic rare enchantment aura with enchant player. At the beginning of enchanted players' post-combat main phase, there's an additional beginning phase after this phase. The reminder text here is useful because it clears some things up. It says the end step happens after the added untap, upkeep, and draw steps. So this references Sphinx of the Second Sun, a card I talked about in my top 10 most confusing cards. And this one is still pretty confusing, even though they cleaned up the reminder text a little bit. In essence, this allows you to untap your mana, get upkeep triggers, and draw an extra card every turn. As long as you play this in your first main phase, you're going to get it going the turn you play it too. However, you don't have time to use that mana on sorcery speed stuff in that second main phase. It's worded weirdly in a way that sort of deceives you, because the first part of the trigger says at the beginning of enchanted player's post-combat main phase. But the second part of that sentence says there is an additional beginning phase after this phase. In other words, you get this beginning phase sandwiched between the end of your second main phase and your end step. And that means you don't have time to do anything at sorcery speed once this triggers and gives you that extra beginning phase. So keep that in mind. This is likely to cause tons of confusion at your pre-release and stuff. It's really interesting that they decided to word both of these cards the way they did, to have the trigger happen to set up your extra phase at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, but then you don't actually get the phase until after your post-combat main phase. Anyway, so how good is this in Limited now that we've cleared up how confusing this card is? Well, it costs 6 and doesn't add to the board, and untapping your lands doesn't always generate meaningful value. So the best part of the card is that it draws you extra cards, and obviously it gets better if you do have instant speed interaction, but in Limited, you're going to have lots of creatures and stuff that this doesn't help with. The mana can often just be meaningless. Obviously, it's strong, but abusing it is difficult since the floor is really low and the ceiling isn't crazy high. It's probably just a C. Next up, it's Strix's Serenade, which for 1 blue mana is a rare instant, counter target artifact, creature, or planeswalker spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. As with removal, that leaves something around for your opponent. Counterspells that do that are pretty bad and limited too, since you're not trading 1 for 1, and you're actually really far from it here, since a 2/2 flyer is pretty much worth a card. You're effectively 2 for 1ing yourself when you cast this, and on top of that, it's a restrictive counterspell. It's just an F. Next up, we've got Tamayo meets the Story Circle, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment saga. Chapter 1 says, until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -2/-0 until end of turn. Chapter 2 says, discard any number of cards, then investigate twice for each card discarded this way. And Chapter 3 says, shuffle up to 3 target cards from your graveyard into your library. So Chapter 1 will make your opponent's next attack pretty close to meaningless, so you've got a good shot at making it to Chapter 2, and that chapter can generate a lot of clues. Chapter 3, meanwhile, is not that great. You are likely to have cards to shuffle because of Chapter 2, but it's still a really weak effect. Overall, I don't like this very much. None of its chapters really generate a full card worth of value, and the whole package barely gets there, and you have to wait for that value, and I think that's a problem. Chapter 2 requires significant setup. You don't always have stuff worth discarding, and you don't always have cards at all. It seems a little awkward both early and late, and that's not good. Getting a bunch of clues is tempting, and that's the most powerful thing this card can do, but it just seems hard to set it up in a valuable way. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Tempest Harvester, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 Merfolk Wizard at common. When it enters, you get 2 energy, and you can tap it and pay an energy to draw a card and then discard a card. This goes well in the energy decks in blue and in the card draw deck in blue, and looting is nice to begin with. It's just a really good effect in Limited, and this comes with the ability to do it twice, all on its own. And of course, like with all energy cards, it's also got the flexibility of giving you energy to use on other stuff, or using energy that's produced by other stuff, and the stat line is almost passable. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Triton Wavebreaker, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 enchantment creature, Merfolk Wizard at uncommon. It's got Bestow for 1 generic and a blue, which means you can play it as an aura with enchant creature. As long as Triton Wavebreaker is a creature, it has prowess. An enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has prowess. A 1 mana 1/1 with prowess is fine. That keyword just plays really well since the threat of activation is very real, and giving something else the buff is often even better. Basically, if you have this on turn 1, you probably play it out as your 1-drop, and if you get it later, it's a great aura that will stick around if the creature you put it on dies. That's how Bestow works. This creature will come into play if the creature it's attached to ever dies, and +1/+1 in prowess is likely to be more useful on something bigger by the middle or later stages of the game anyway. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Tune the Narrative, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant. Draw a card, you get 2 energy. This reminds me of Birthday Escape, a common that really overperformed. Both of them are 1 mana cards that draw you a card and then give you some set-specific value that seems kind of like a small effect. Now, Getting Tempted by the Ring had more inherent value, and energy doesn't necessarily, but blue has enough places to spend energy that I think this will still feel like you're getting like a card and a half a lot of the time, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Ugin's Binding, which for 2 generic and a blue is a mythic rare instant with Devoid. Return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and whenever you cast a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater, you may exile Ugin's Binding from your graveyard. When you do, return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. Well, this is cool. A 3 mana instant that bounces a non-land permanent is probably a C-. We usually get this effect for 2 mana, but most of those don't have insane Cyclonic Rift from the graveyard upside like Ugin's Binding does. This probably needs a build-around grade because if you don't have like 2 cards that can trigger Binding, it's just a bad bounce spell. It's a C- in your typical deck, but it's a B+ in decks that can get the Rift side going. Next up, it's Unfathomable Truths, which for 4 generic and a blue is a common instant with Devoid. You draw 3 and create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add colorless. So this is a draw spell that does add to the board, even if it does so in a really small way, but it also ramps your mana. 5 mana to draw 3 at instant speed is an okay-ish rate to begin with. This will work nicely in blue-green ramp decks and in the blue-black draw extra cards deck. It is still a card that adds really minimally to the board, and you really can't have that many of them, and there are better ones around in this set. So I don't see this making the cut like with regularity. It's probably a C-. Next up, it's Utter Insignificance, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common enchantment aura with flash and enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and has base power and toughness 1/1, and you can pay 2 generic and a colorless to exile the enchanted creature. This is intriguing. As I already mentioned, effects that don't remove a creature entirely aren't usually very good in Limited because you actually end up behind on cards. But because this has flash, you can often turn it into a removal spell like Combat Trick, provided your opponent's creature is in combat. And if they don't have a creature in combat, you can still put this on something and exile it later with the ability. It also only costs 2 mana, which is pretty efficient. I'm probably going to regret this because every time I think a blue removal spell is premium and Limited, it doesn't pan out, but I'm maybe making that mistake again, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Volatile Storm Drake, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 3/2 Drake at rare. It has flying and hexproof from activated and triggered abilities, and when it enters a battlefield, exchange control of Volatile Storm Drake and target creature an opponent controls. If you do, you get 4 energy, then sacrifice that creature unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. This is a fun take on Gilded Drake, but Gilded Drake is awful and limited, and this is too. This is effectively a really bad removal spell, one that gives your opponent a 3/2 flyer. People aren't going to be reanimating big scary monsters in this format or cheating them into play. Maybe the creature you get is better, but if you don't have the energy to pay to keep it, and even if you do have the energy to pay to keep it, you gave your opponent something really valuable in exchange for whatever you took. The gap in value between the Storm Drake and whatever you take from your opponent isn't likely to be all that wide, so it just ends up being a pretty bad card. I think it's just an F. All right, let's close things out in blue with a look at the 3 double-faced cards. The first one is Hydroelectric Specimen, which is a modal double-faced card that means you can choose to play one side or the other. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 1/4 weird at uncommon. It's got flash, and when it enters, you can change the target of target instant or sorcery spell with a single target to Hydroelectric Specimen. The other side is Hydroelectric Laboratory. As it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 life, and if you don't, it enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for blue. Redirecting a removal spell to the Specimen is an okay effect and more than decent if the Specimen can survive the removal spell when the original target couldn't. When you do that, it feels really good, but it does have to line up perfectly for that to actually happen. Otherwise, you're still trading 1 for 1 and it isn't that impressive, but it's fine. Overall, the enter the battlefield ability being super situational isn't as much of a problem as it would normally be, because on the other side, it's just a land, and sometimes you're just going to want to play it that way. I'm giving this a C+. Our other modal double-faced card is Sink into Stupor, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant, and you return target spell or non-land permanent opponent controls to its owner's hand. The other side is a land with the exact same text box as Hydroelectric Specimen's land side. This one looks great. Sure, you don't trade 1 for 1 with Sink into Stupor, but stopping a spell from resolving or bouncing something has a real impact on the game. It can give you some serious tempo, and you can also run this out as a land, of course. I'm giving this a B-. And then our last card is Tamiyo, Inquisitive Student. She is not a modal double face card. She's just a regular one where you have to transform her one way or another. She costs 1 blue mana for a 0/3 legendary Moonfolk Wizard at Mythic Rare. She's got flying. When she attacks, you investigate. And when you draw your 3rd card in a turn, you exile her and then transform her. She comes back as Tamiyo, Seasoned Scholar, a 2 loyalty legendary planeswalker. She's got a +2 that says, until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks, you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn. She has a -3 that says, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. If it's a green card, add 1 mana of any color. And she's got a -7 that says, draw cards equal to half the number of cards in your library, round it up, you get an emblem with, you have no maximum hand size. Yeah, that's right, she's a 1 mana planeswalker. Okay, she's not always a planeswalker, but she's still 1 mana, and transforming her isn't that far-fetched. A 1 mana 0/3 flyer that makes a clue when it attacks is probably a decent card to begin with, and you only need to make 2 clues to have what you need to transform her. So even on her own, she can transform, especially if she comes down on turn 1, but blue is well equipped to transform her beyond that, as we've seen throughout this video, and once she does transform, you get a nice planeswalker. She's not game-breaking, especially because she can only use that +2 right when she comes into play. It's probably a good thing that she's not game-breaking since she's only 1 mana, but she's still pretty good. Her +2 does make it hard for your opponent to take her down right away. Her -3 draws you a card more or less, and her -7 can win you the game. It sort of feels like if you get her early, you're going to stick to the +2 and try to win with her ultimate, and if you get her later, you probably +2 and then use the -3 to get a removal spell back. But the efficiency here is nuts, so I'm giving her a B+. So those are all the blue cards in Modern Horizons 3. In the next video, I'll take a look at all the black ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on this set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.